So here we are back again for part two. We were talking about the competitive forces of the supplier bargaining power and the buyer's bargaining power and etc. So that's a good slide to review. And the suppliers with strong bargaining power, these are a source of real competitive pressure. So you want to assess those before making your strategy and your move. Because their ability to change the industry members can drive prices. They can be higher. They can pass costs on to them, and they can limit opportunities to find better deals, as your company may have surmised that you could otherwise. Now, figure 3.5 from the book shows the factors that affect the strengths of suppliers, like substitutes, new entrants, and even buyers. So this is going to determine the strength of the supplier's bargaining power along the way. Now, the competitive forces of potential new entrants, all of these things are impacting the competitive forces that we've been talking about. And suppliers and now new entrants. So new entrants into an industry threaten the position of a rival, since they will completely compete fiercely in the marketplace, and they'll add to the number the industry rivals that already exist, and they'll add to the industry's production capacity. Remember, it's a supply and demand driving prices, and so even if you're the original company, you're considering the new entrants. But if you're a new entrant, you're considering the pricing capacity your entry can make that happen. Southwest did that and went for low fare and had a way of cutting costs below anybody else because they went with that one airframe along the way. So the next question we'd want to ask ourselves is, then what are the barriers to entry into a market if I'm a new entrant? Well, the strength of the threat of entry is governed in large by the degree of the height of the industry's entry barriers, right? It was perceived that the airline industry for a long time had high barriers to entry, and Southwest showed that just wasn't true. It didn't go to the mainstream commercial airports. It went to a side airport nearby that wanted to grow and would charge fewer fees. So high barriers, and so the mainline competitors, the United and the American Airlines, didn't consider that a threat. They should have. High barriers reduce the threat of potential entry, right? Had the airlines been right, and that a Southwest couldn't go to a side airport, like in Chicago, you've got Midway, right, instead of O'Hare, then Southwest wouldn't have been a threat, but they had missed that point. So whether an industry's entry barriers ought to be considered high or low is really going to depend on the resources or capabilities possessed by this pool of entrants that want to get in. High entry barriers and weak entry threats today do not always translate into high entry barriers and weak entry threats tomorrow, as Southwest pointed out to us. Figure 3.6 from the book, factors affecting the threat of entry. This really summarizes the factors that cause this overall competitive pressure from potential entrants to be weak or strong, right? So an analysis of these factors can help managers determine whether the threat of entry into their industry is high or low, or in general, right? Sometimes it's hard to tell. You might want to pause, study the slide, make some notes, but self-explanatory. Now, when is the competitive force of rivalry most intense amongst competing sellers? Well, the strongest of the 5 competitive forces is often the rivalry for buyer patronage among the competing sellers of the product or service. It's market share, right? How do you get market share? What if competitors are equal in size and capability? What if rivals can boost market standing and business performance, right? Et cetera, et cetera. You can read the slide yourself. It's fairly self-explanatory. So the next question we ask is, when is the competitive force of rivalry among competitors, competing sellers weak? Right? Well, the industry of rivalry among competing sellers within the industry, it depends on the number of identifiable factors, right? Is there differentiation between the products? Are the markets or the market segments growing or shrinking, right? And because markets are compromised of a vast number of small rivals already. The mom and pop stores, if I'm a bread factory and I write up mom and pop bakeries around town, right? So the market's already comprised of them. These things should be considered in your analysis. Now, this figure 3.7 shows factors affecting the strength of a competitive rivalry. So this is really a summary of those factors that affect rivalry in the industry. And it identifies that those that intensify or weaken the rivalry and how they vary in direct competition in the industry. So worth pausing and reviewing. Now, the industry rivalry itself can be cutthroat or brutal, fierce, moderate, or weak. The competitive strengths of individual industry rivals and the strengths of the five forces, the competitive forces, acting on the industry interactively, these combine to intensify or diminish the competitive nature of the industry itself. Now, the strengths of the five forces and the industry probability. So the five competitive forces are never really static. One or all the forces are changing all the time, either increasing or decreasing, either individually or collectively. And they have an effect on the potential for competitors to operate and earn a profit in the industry. So assessing whether each of the five forces gives rise to a strong, a moderate, or a weak competitive pressure, that's going to set the stage for the overall strength of the five forces and their effort to produce or create a conducive environment for profitability, right? Which is important to your strategy. So the strongest of the five forces determines the extent of the downward pressure on an industry's profitability. Having more than one strong force means that an industry has multiple competitive challenges with which to cope, which can be very challenging. Now, when do the five competitive forces result in an attractive condition? Well, when the five competitive forces are weak in an industry, the opportunity for competitors to earn profits is going to increase. There's that inverse relationship there, worth noting. Now, when do the five competitive forces result in an unattractive industry conditions? Well, we come back to profitability. Profitability is difficult or sometimes impossible to achieve when these competitive forces acting on the industry interfere with the strategic direction, right? So that would be the thing that you want to consider in large part. Now, the next question to ask then is, what are the driving forces of change? And what impact will they have? Well, driving forces are the major underlying cause of change in industry and competitive conditions. In the cable TV industry, there's been driving forces from coaxial cable, which was your typical cable company, to fiber optics because it can run more data faster in a stream. Well, then, now we've moved on to driving forces being 5G. 5G, because when we walk down the street with our phone, we want to keep watching the movie or TV show that we've signed up for. We don't want breaks in that, and 5G is going to deliver that. So that's an example of the driving forces in the industry and the modifying the competitive conditions. So driving force analysis has 3 steps. Identify what the driving forces are, assess whether the drivers of the change are, on the whole, acting to make the industry more or less attractive, and then finally determining what strategy changes are needed to prepare for the impact of the driving forces. Now here is your core concept. It's just driving forces. These are the major underlying cause of change in an industry. Again, for Southwest Airlines, it was the access to commercial airfields suitable for Boeing 737 that were near a major industrial complex like Chicago, or their focus on the lack of airflow, commercial airflow in the Southwest, hence the name Southwest Airlines, right? So these are some common driving factors. The most important part of driving force analysis is to determine whether the total impact of the driving forces will increase or decrease market demand, right? Will 5G and that driving force increase or decrease market demand for the internet? I think it will increase, right? And so will that make more competition or less? Or will it lead to higher or lower profitability? It comes back to profitability again. So the real payoff of driving force analysis is to help us understand what strategy changes are needed to prepare for the impact of these driving forces. Now the next question is, how are industry rivals positioned to address this? Well, the best technique for revealing market positions of industry competitors is a strategic group mapping. So within the industry, companies commonly sell in different price and quantity ranges, right? We've all seen that, a tiered sales structure. So, and that will appeal to different types of buyers in different geographic areas and so on. So some of the more attractively positioned rivals are out there compared to others, right? There's a benefit, right, that some have. So understanding which companies are strongly positioned and which are weakly positioned is integral to analyzing the industry's competitive structure. Which brings us to the core concept that strategic group mapping and strategic group mapping and strategic groups. So strategic group mapping is that technique for displaying the different market or competitive positions of rival firms in the industry. Then you want to evaluate the strategy options that entails examining what strategic groups exist. And you want to identify the companies within each group and determine if a competitive white space exists where industry competitors are able to create and capture this altogether new demand, which can be very exciting. So constructing a group map, you can read the slides here. You want to identify the competitive characteristics and then plot firms on a 2-variable map, X, Y, for example. Assign firms that occupy the same map location a common strategic value, so you're grouping or affinitizing them, and then draw circles around each strategic group proportional to the size of the group's share of the market, their total revenues. Okay? So here were some further guidelines for strategic map construction. You can pause and read those. The 2 variables selected as axes for the map should not be highly correlated, right? If they are, the circles on the map are going to fall along a diagonal and really reveal nothing about comparison. Strategic group maps should reveal which firms are close competitors and which are distant competitors. Here is an example of them mapped on the axis. And notice from this shows that 2-dimensional group mapping diagrams for the U.S. Casual dining industry. I think it's very interesting. Okay, we'll pause there and come back.